Hey everyone, Danny from the CBAA here. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, running your AGM during COVID-19. Before we get started, our session is coming to you today from Gadigal land, and as such we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which we're meeting, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, paying respects to elders past and present. Please feel free to shout out the traditional owners of the land from which you're joining us there in the chat section. Also in the chat is where you can ask questions of your presenters, and you can sort of put forward any thoughts that you might have. I'll also be sharing some links to the chat a little bit later on as we come to a few topics. I'm seeing that there's a bit of action going on there in the chat at the moment. Peter's saying hello from Awabakal land. G'day, Peter. Be sure to follow his lead. Let us know your name and the station that you're joining us on behalf of. As today's session, running your AGM during COVID-19, continues to impact all aspects of operations within the community radio sector. As we head into the time of year in which many of our stations conduct their annual general meeting, today's webinar will give guidance as to how your station might best conduct your administrative practices and business remotely, safely, responsibly, and in full compliance of your obligations. Our session will include presentation, links to further reading, and of course the opportunity for you to interact with us. Now, John is the CEO of the Community Broadcasting Association of Australia. John could probably give you a bit of a better description about who he is, but I can let you know that prior to joining the CBAA, John served in key leadership roles as CEO of the Public Relations Institute of Australia, the Chief Executive on the Council of the Ageing, and the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the Fundraising Institute Australia. He knows a thing or two about running a not-for-profit, and very happy to have him leading this session today. Couldn't think of anyone better to do it. John, what I will do is I will give you the screen, and then you can get started on today's session. You should be able to start sharing now, hopefully.
Thanks, Danny, and I think you should all be able to see my screen now. Is that correct?
We can indeed. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Great. So today, firstly, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining me and begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which we meet today. In my case, that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Today's webinar, we're going to, if I can get the slide to change, there we go. In today's webinar, I'm going to spend about 20 minutes talking to you or taking you through the four phases of running an AGM. We'll then take some questions through the chat functionality here on Zoom. However, if you have some questions or would like some clarification as we go through, then I'll try to answer it as we move through the session. So please put that up in the chat box as we sort of go through. The four key phases we're going to discuss today are firstly deciding to hold an AGM remotely because of COVID-19, and that's probably the part that we'll spend most time on. Planning the remote AGM, we'll talk about a little bit about that, managing a remote AGM, and then following up after an AGM. But before we commence, I'd just like you to do a bit of a quick poll to give Danny and I a bit of an idea of where you're all based, because one of the things that is important is that a lot of this depends on where you are based. So if you can, I'll give you a minute or two just to complete the poll that Danny has put up on the screen.
Excellent. Thanks so much, everyone. We're at 90% of votes right about now, getting close to 100%. I'll leave it open for another few seconds or so. But yeah, definitely get down there and vote so we've got a clearer picture.
I hope you can all see that. And what we've got is we've got about the majority, 38% of people in New South Wales and about 35% in Victoria, and a small number of people from the rest of the country, ACT, no one from Northern Territory, a few from Queensland, South Australia, Tasmania, and of course Western Australia. That gives us a good idea of what we're going to talk about today. So thank you for that. Moving on, the first topic I wanted to talk about is deciding to hold an AGM remotely. And this is one of the key issues and probably the key issue or the key question we're getting from stations ringing Danny or the CBAA office is, what do I do about my AGM in the light of physical distancing and shutdown requirements imposed during COVID? So you first need to decide if your station can hold its AGM in an unusual way, that is, or whether you have to do it remotely through the use of technology, or if indeed you should postpone the meeting until restrictions are lifted. So let's talk first about if you can still hold the AGM in person. Depending on where you live in Australia, social distancing rules may allow you to still run an AGM in person, but just because you can doesn't mean you should. The CBAA is encouraging all stations to seriously consider practicalities and, most importantly, the health and well-being of those people that would attend the AGM. I have heard this week when I sent out the invitation to attend this webinar from a lot of stations who have already successfully held their AGMs in person around the country. Each station needs to make that call on their own, considering all the different circumstances. So if you are considering going ahead, then I urge all of you to review and continue to monitor the latest rules in your state or area, and of course ensure physical distancing and hygiene principles are considered and implemented. Just a bit of basic idea across the country to show you how different it is. Obviously in Victoria, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to conduct an AGM in person. In New South Wales, there are limits of 150 people or one person per 4 square metres. In Tasmania, it's gathering of 250 people, and in Western Australia, the limits are simply restricted to one person per 2 square metres. So you can see it's different across the country, and you need to decide whether it's possible for your station to hold an AGM in person or not. It may depend on how many members you have and are likely to attend an AGM. Obviously, for a station that has 200 members that regularly attend an AGM, and that would be a very big station, obviously, then it may be more difficult than a station that only has 20 or 25 or 30 people that attend their AGM regularly. As I said earlier, these rules are changing all the time, so please ensure that you check the latest rules and of course ensure physical distancing and hygiene principles are considered and implemented if you decide to go ahead with a face-to-face meeting. I think the thing I want to spend most time on today is really talking about what to do if you can't hold a face-to-face meeting. So we're going to talk a little bit now about checking that holding an AGM remotely is allowed by your station, because that is not necessarily a simple process, and one depending on where you live, where your station is based, how your legal structure, how you're registered, decisions of your regulator, whether you're a charity, and what the Constitution says. I'll come back to that process in a few minutes. But what I want to just talk about first is I'll just run through the rest of the comments that I want to make about deciding to hold an AGM remotely. So, your Constitution, make sure that you check your Constitution, what it says about running meetings or general meetings remotely. And if it says you can't, then you may want to consider sometime in the future changing your Constitution to allow you to run remote meetings, whether that's in a temporary measure for situations like COVID-19 or a more permanent option if it makes the meeting more accessible for people. Also, don't forget to consult with your stakeholders. Your members are critical, your board members and your committee members are also critical. So identify who your stakeholders are and put put the proposal or a remote meeting out to them. This will help identify any issues with the proposal early and allow you to find solutions or make other arrangements. And don't forget the deadlines for holding meetings. Just because of COVID doesn't mean that if your constitution says you have to give 21 days notice for a meeting that you can give less. Those rules don't change. So whether in person or remote meetings, particularly AGMs, make sure you consider the deadlines. These may be set by the regulator, such as the state regulator for incorporated associations, or ASIC if you're a company limited by guarantee, or by the station's constitution or governing rules. In extraordinary circumstances such as those brought about by COVID-19, there may be extensions or ways around that, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Also, don't forget to consider the costs involved. Some providers of video conferencing like Zoom that we're on offer free versions. Some of those free versions have limited functionality and capabilities. Make sure that the system you use can cope with the AGM that you need to run. And different stations are going to have different needs. Maybe that your station needs to spend a little bit more money on an effective solution. Similarly, there may be other technology-related costs that may come with remote meeting, for example, devices, microphones, webcams, online voting solutions, those sorts of things. I'd now just move to, let's talk a little bit about whether your station can actually hold a remote meeting. Firstly, the requirements to conduct an AGM remotely for your station will depend on three things. Firstly, the legal structure of the organisation, including who your regulator is, whether or not your station is registered with the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission as a charity, and of course the station's constitution. To get an idea about what legal structures your station has, it would be great if you could respond to the poll that Danny's about to put up. Danny's just put up now, and let us know how you're all legally structured. I'll give you about 30 seconds to complete that poll.
Thanks so much, everyone. We're nearly there, about 80% voting. If you're able to get in your votes now, I'll shut the poll in just a second.
Thanks, Danny. So we've got about 60%, which is what I would have expected of stations that are incorporated associations. We've got about 10% that are companies limited by guarantee, which is under the Corporations Act of federal registration. Got about 26 that are cooperatives, and we've got 5% that are not sure. I'd certainly suggest to those that are not sure to go and find out how your station is registered, because that has a big bearing on whether you can run an AGM remotely or not. I'd also just like to ask a really quick question, another poll around whether your station is a charity. So Danny will put that up as well. If you could just take 20 seconds to fill that one out as well, gives us a bit of an idea of the direction that we'll take this webinar.
Thanks everyone for your quick responses to this. We're nearly done. I'll shut this poll in just a couple of seconds, but thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Danny. And we've got about 46% that are charities, about 49% that aren't charities, and about 5% that are non-sure. So again, I'd suggest those stations that aren't sure to go and check whether they're a charity or not. I'd also encourage those stations that said no to go and register to be a charity. Being a charity is not a complex process. You simply go to the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission website and you can register on there. And Danny, if you give Danny a call, we'll be able to give you some guidance around that as well. So first, I'll just talk a little bit about legal structure. So the majority of stations were incorporated associations, and the AGM requirements for incorporated associations vary depending on state or territory in which the organisation is registered, and we'll discuss those differences shortly. As a couple of people have pointed out, some states have given stations or organisations permission to defer their AGMs because of COVID, and different regulators in different states have different arrangements around that, and I'll come to that in a minute. If you're a company limited by guarantee, ASIC is allowing stations or companies to hold AGMs through the use of technology such as video conferencing to provide notice of meetings electronically, for example, by emailing. This means that as long as members are given the opportunity to participate, vote, speak, and put questions to the board or committee at a meeting, companies are able to hold their AGMs remotely. And that's regardless of what it says in your station's constitution. So if you're a company limited by guarantee and your constitution says you have to have in-person meetings, you are allowed to have a meeting, an AGM that is virtual because of COVID. Just bear in mind at the moment that's in place until the 6th of November 2020. It's quite likely that'll be extended, I think, but bear that in mind. Just also bear in mind, if you're a company limited by guarantee, that ASIC has announced that if you get it a little bit wrong, that it'll take no action against companies that would usually required to hold their AGM. The ACNC, so if you're a charity, the ACNC has also advised that AGMs of registered charities, stations that are charities, can be postponed if they can't be conducted safely, and they won't take any action unless there is evidence of wider non-compliance. And just to note that ACMA has also expressed their flexibility to us. So I think, bear that in mind if you're considering whether to hold your AGM or not hold your AGM, whether to hold it virtually or whether to defer it. In terms of cooperatives, there was a number of stations that were cooperatives. Cooperatives usually have to hold their annual general meeting within 5 months of the end of their financial year. So essentially 2 options. You can extend the time to hold your AGM, and in Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia and Queensland, the regulators there of cooperatives can seek an extension of time for their AGMs, and the fee for that application can be waived. In New South Wales, cooperatives can delay their AGMs and annual returns without application. This arrangement is placed for 6 months from the 30th of April. So that time is nearly up. Again, likely to be extended, I think. Or you can hold your AGM using online meeting technology. So there's your options there. If you're a charity, just make sure you are regulated by the ACNC as well as potentially ASIC or potentially your regulator in your state, so make sure you're across their requirements as well, which are pretty simple. They just say in their governance standard 2 that the charities have to be accountable to their members, and one common way of doing that is through the holding of an AGM. So, as I've said, whether or not your station can hold an AGM remotely will depend on the rules, the law in your state and the approach of your regulator. Our friends at Not-for-Profit Law have produced a brief flowchart, which I'll go through now to help you work out what you can do before proceeding. So, and this flowchart we'll make available after the webinar for you to have a look at. But before I take you through this, I'd just like to say that we do understand this is confusing, so that we want to reassure you that the most important thing you can do at this time is to act in good faith and be clear in your communications with your members. Regulators are very unlikely to take action if you, or will take a facilitative approach given the current circumstances if you do those things. So act in good faith and be really clear in your communications with your members. I'll just take you through this flowchart now. Firstly, so the question is, can we hold our not-for-profits AGM remotely because of COVID? So if your rules or your regulator allow you to use technology to run meetings, you can conduct your AGM remotely. So the two things here are, if your rules or your regulator allow you to do that. This applies to all companies limited by guarantee and all incorporated associations in Victoria and Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia, regardless of what is in the organisation's rules. So if you're in Victoria and your constitution says you can't run an AGM remotely, you are allowed to because of COVID, because your regulator has given you permission. This also applies to incorporated associations that use the model rules in Queensland or Western Australia. I hope that's relatively clear. If your rules are unclear, so if your constitution is unclear about the use of technology in running general meetings, you may need to seek some advice or legal advice about postponing or holding your meeting remotely. This applies to incorporated associations using the model rules in Northern Territory, Tasmania and ACT. Just bear in mind those three states are probably the states that you can most likely still run a physical AGM, or territories in the case of Northern Territory and ACT. If your rules explicitly do not allow the use of technology in running general meetings, and your regulators haven't given you permission, then you may need to notify your members and your regulator of your intention to postpone your AGM. Most of the regulators have a simple form for that process. So fairly complex, but I think for the majority of you are here from Victoria and New South Wales, the key there is that if you're an incorporated association, which most of you are, then you can run your AGM remotely regardless of your constitution. If you are a company limited by guarantee, ASIC has also given you permission, regardless of your constitution, to run your AGM remotely. If you are a cooperative, you can basically do the same thing. So I have one question there I'll just answer. So if this is from Carolyn, if your constitution doesn't allow it, is it legal to put a temporary allowance for virtual prior to, like you said, adding it to your constitution? So Carolyn, just to clarify, some of this, it will depend to some degree on where you are based. So if you are an incorporated association in New South Wales, for example, yes, you can run your AGM remotely, same as if you're in Victoria.
Yes, I believe, Caroline, I believe you're dialing in from Victoria.
Okay, now moving on. I now talk a little bit about managing a remote AGM. So once you've decided that you can run one remotely and you're allowed to run one, there's a number of the 6 things that are probably worth you considering. So firstly providing notice of the meeting. Even a remote meeting requires your station to provide notice to its members, supporters, stakeholders, or whoever is allowed to attend. Make sure that notice is clear about the format of the meeting, the agenda, and how you will manage certain actions in the remote setting. For example, how votes will be taken, how people can ask questions and speak, how attendance will be recorded. It's a good idea to ask people to submit questions in advance. Having questions in advance of a meeting can make the whole meeting easier to manage. It is still important, though, to allow questions during the meeting, but for any questions that we can send ahead of the meeting, it will be helpful to have them and help you run a meeting more smoothly. I mentioned this briefly before, but select the provider carefully, whether it's Zoom, whether it's Teams, whether it's another provider out there. Consider do you need video as well as audio? And I think we're all through COVID got very used to using video, so I would certainly be recommending that. It's much easier when you can see people's faces. Does everyone need to be able to speak? Probably for an AGM, I would suggest they do. Does the session need to be recorded? Well, that's a decision for you to make. I'm not personally a fan of recording meetings, but that's certainly an option open to people. And of course, many providers have free options as well as paid services. And Jason has just asked in there, has CBAA negotiated a discounted deal for member stations to utilise meeting software? Quite a few of those, quite a few of the support providers, and I think Zoom is one, has charity deals that allow either free or discounted access. So have a look at, for example, the Connecting Up website. Connecting Up is an organisation that provides access to software for charities, either free of charge or at significant discounts. Offer help and support in providing notice of the meeting and its format is really important to provide people a way for people to get help and support in joining the meeting. This may be having someone to call to be able to help people over the phone, or it might be using the help and support that is part of a service provider. Do a test meeting. Danny and I did a bit of a test of this webinar earlier. It's really important, if you've not done anything like that before, do a test meeting. So we'll highlight any difficulties and identify areas in which a station needs to be more prepared. Consider the meeting process. A meeting held remotely still needs to cover all the requirements your station would cover in a regular meeting. Make sure your station is clear about how it's going to record the minutes and distribute them, how it will allow participation from attendees, listening, speaking and voting, how it will distribute documents during the meeting, how the ordinary process of a traditional meeting will work in a remote setting. Moving on, one of the other key is actually managing the remote AGM once you've got it going. Firstly, don't forget that AGMs and other member meetings are important, are really important for the ongoing operation of most community radio stations. So I remind you from previous sections, firstly, ensure that your meeting notice contains clear instructions for joining the meeting. You know, if you're using Zoom, make sure the Zoom link is up front and centre and you don't have to, a member doesn't have to loop back through 10 emails to find it. Use technology that enables each member to ask questions, make comments or record a vote. Where decisions need to be made at the meeting, consider using a postal ballot, maybe in advance, so that members who wish to join the meeting online will have adequate opportunity to cast their vote. Make the meeting concise. AGMs don't need to go on for hours. For remote meetings, a temporary option for an extraordinary circumstance like COVID, it may be worth foregoing matters that are not essential. If your station expects to have a meeting in person again, a special general meeting or something else within a reasonable time, then other non-essential matters could be covered then. Keep the regular housekeeping rules. So if you don't change things significantly from how you would normally run an AGM, except where you have to. It can be more difficult though to manage time remotely, so make sure there is sufficient time allocated to each part of the meeting. Manage the voting process, and there's been a few people in the comments ask about voting, and there's a number of ways you can do it, and I think the complexity of it to some degree depends on what the voting is for, how many people are voting, and all those sorts of things. So there are a variety of ways you could do it. You could do emails during or after the meeting. You could do a poll or survey using the video conference service or a separate service. You could get a separate voting app. I know Technorama, for example, has used an app for voting purposes. Or you could do a paper ballot by post. There's a number of ways to do that. I'd suggest not overcomplicating it, but making it something that's fairly simple And again, the more complex your organisation is, the more advanced a system you may need for voting. But certainly for the majority of community radio stations, I think a fairly simple but fair system is really important, because you need to make sure the right people are voting, that everyone that has that is eligible to vote can vote, and it's transparent and it's fair. Again, whatever method your station chooses, it should be explained to the attendees and those absent. The process should be transparent, the results should be shared. And as I've said, there are a number of common apps or software programs available to assist with the voting process if necessary. And of course, manage the questions. For questions that aren't considered in advance, consider how your station will manage them in real time. There are a variety of ways you might do this. Email during the meeting to a central email that someone's monitoring, chat or message board in the video conference service or via a separate service, text messages or phone chat group to a central number, audio questions in real time for attendees. Again, depends on the complexity of your organisation and how you want to do it. Responding to questions is a really important part of this consideration too. Consider how the responses will work, who is going to respond, and whether there is room for a broader discussion on the back of questions. Not all formats will work for this. It's important to be clear about the process and any moderating that goes into it. So, very briefly then, what do you do after the AGM? Make sure you have a way to finalise the meeting minutes. It's important to keep your station's regular post-meeting process. If you're a company limited by guarantee, you're supposed to finalise your minutes within a month of your AGM. If you're an incorporated association, it's always good practice to distribute or make those draft AGM minutes available and then approve them at the following year's meeting. There's no reason you should really change that process going forward. And make sure, again, you distribute those minutes in the way that you normally do so and in a timely manner. And be clear about how you're going to do that. Is it, for example, email or post? So they're the key things I had to talk about today. But before we move on to questions, here's a couple of resources. I think Danny's put some other links into the chat as we've gone through. We'll also place information on the CBAA website as we go forward. So now I'd like to open up for questions if people have them. I think there's a few here. I might just go through. I can see them, Danny. So Kerry asks, when I'm talking about meeting providers, are you talking about providers like Zoom? Yes, I am. And there's numerous ones of them. Personally, I like Zoom. I find it really easy, but there's others like Teams. There's a multitude of them out there. You need to use the one that's, I would suggest, think about the simplicity of it. You don't want people having to go through complex processes to sign into your AGM. You need to make it as simple for people with different IT literature, you know what I mean, different levels of different skills around using technology to log in. Kerry also asks about hybrid meetings. Certainly possible, and I think it depends again on your station and the state and your location. Hybrid meetings add another level of complexity. You've got to make sure whoever's chairing that meeting doesn't forget the people online. I've seen that happen very often. And often when you have 5, 10, 20 people in a room, it becomes very hard for the people on the videos to actually hear what's going on, because you only need one person ruffling papers, and it's really difficult. So my comment around hybrid, unless you're using very good technology, you can isolate the sound to the chair or other people, the front of the room. Then I'd be very careful about hybrid and think it through before you do that. Another question from Alan. He's asked, should everyone be on mute when the meeting starts? Again, look, it's a process for you to work through. I know when I'm running meetings, I find it's very good to everyone start on mute, introducing and making sure there's some housekeeping rules about how you actually put yourself up to speak, whether that's using the system, which sometimes have little buttons you can push for hands to come up, or maybe, I find in a smaller group, just waving is probably the best way to do it. Again, it's all about housekeeping and having a plan about how you're going to do that, because it's nothing worse than a video conference where 10 people try and speak at once. So yes, I would say start on mute. Again, Marie's asked, can you hold your AGM outdoors to allow for social distancing? You can hold your AGM outdoors, no problem at all. Probably wouldn't try a hybrid outdoors. Again, you need to make sure what happens if it rains, what are your alternative arrangements, and those sort of things. John McGuinness, hi John. John's from Three-Way, and his constitution, he says, is quite old and was based on model rules in force at the time of their formation 30 years ago. As you say, it probably makes no mention of remote meetings because it has never been an issue until now. Basically, your options are, because you're in Victoria, the Incorporated Associations Register regulator has given you permission to run a virtual meeting, so that you should be able to do that. Anne has asked, she sent this through on chat too, so when I get to the chat messages, I'll try not to repeat, but wondering about whether PowerPoint screens can be emailed to participants after this webinar. Definitely, we'll make that available in one way or another. Danny, I haven't had a look at the chat. Do you want to, have you got some questions arising from the chat that might be easy to put to me?
I do indeed have some questions there. Some questions there about Victorian stations and the postponing of the AGM. That is, this is from Robert Bonte. We're in Victoria, an incorporated association, and prefer to postpone the physical meeting for 3 months and avoid a virtual meeting. Will the ACNC allow such a postponement? I believe that postponement is made with Consumer Affairs Victoria, and they should indeed allow it.
Look, I think you're right, Danny. Certainly in Victoria, the Register is granting a 3-month extension and waiving the usual fee. I'm not sure what the usual fee is. And also the ACNC is, as I said a little bit earlier in the meeting, allowing meetings to be postponed and to consider these sorts of things. So again, as long as you do, I would suggest that as long as you're really clear with your members, you check what you need to do, and if you can postpone your meeting, that's a realistic option open to you.
Teresha Page asks a question, which is, I guess, is a sort of converse of that. If we've put in an application to Consumer Affairs Victoria to defer the AGM by 3 months, can we still go ahead and hold the AGM before that 3 months, given that in Victoria we are given the green light to hold remote meetings regardless of our constitutional rules?
I think that's a really good question, and actually one I don't know the answer to. You may need to give them a call and check whether you can do that. I wouldn't have thought it was too much of a problem, but you never know what Consumer Affairs would likely say. So give them a call or send them an email and check that one out. It's probably not one I've heard. Greg, I've seen Greg King has a question here about having numerous members that are elderly and without internet access, and that one of the things those members often do is attend the AGM and listen, and there's a bit of a concern about them being disenfranchised. Look, I think this is a balance. Firstly, I'd say, do you need to hold an AGM? There may be a reason that you need to hold it, and I think you've said in here you've scheduled it for the 27th of November. If you need to hold one, then you probably need to go ahead with one. Otherwise, you could defer it, and you're based in Victoria, so you would be able to defer that for up to 3 months. That's why I think it's really important you consult with stakeholders and let them know what you're thinking about doing and getting them to have some input. And the ones that have some concerns is talking to them and helping them through the process. I think that's really important. We're in unusual circumstances, and it's, you just need to make sure that you're being fair and transparent and talking this through. There's nothing perfect in these circumstances. I think there are actually some real advantages to online meetings, particularly for organisations that have people spread out over large areas. It means you can potentially have greater accessibility and more people attend.
Excellent. Peter asks a question. I have a concern that the current flexible environment provides the station committee with the opportunity to avoid running an AGM within a reasonable time. What avenues do individual station members have to counteract this?
Look, I think it's really important that we put the trust in our committees, and committees have to have the flexibility to do what they believe is in the best interests of the station. You can't defer AGMs indefinitely. In Victoria, for example, you can defer them for 3 months. In other jurisdictions, it's different periods of time. So I think we have to trust our committees to do the right thing, and not every member is going to be happy with that. But the last thing we want to do during these times is create friction and issues within our station. A board of directors or a committee has the right to make those decisions on behalf of the station, and they should be able to make those decisions as long as they are consulting, being transparent and acting in good faith.
Excellent. Jason Wilson asks, what are the tried and tested voting apps that might be available to a station?
It's a really good question. I'm not sure how many are tried and tested, all have their pros and cons. I'm certainly looking at it at the moment. I think, again, it depends on the complexity of your organisation. I'm looking at it for the sake of CBAA at the moment, and it's much more complex for us to run when you have certain people, large numbers of people to run an AGM through technology and voting than it may be for a relatively small station with only 20 or 30 members. So I don't have a concrete answer on that. Danny, it might be good we let people know the system that Technorama is using for their AGM, and they've used that over a number of years. You can Google numerous systems. Some have costs, some are free.
Yeah, I'll liaise with Technorama and pass that on, because I've made note there in the chat that following today's session, all of the resources that we're referring to will be sent to registrants as part of follow-up. So it's going to be a pretty sizable email, because there's a lot of interesting stuff we're talking about today, but we'll include that option in there. Robert Gilchrist asks, and this is a very pertinent question, I'd say. Some of our members have no email. Can we cover them by telephone or offer them postal ballots for new directors? And I'd go on further to Robert's question. What are stations with members who might not sort of be that engaged with up-to-date technology? How can they get involved with an online/virtual AGM?
Really good question. And firstly, I'll talk about how they can be involved. So some AGM platforms, Zoom, for example, allows people to dial in on a telephone. So people can use some of those systems. Obviously, a telephone wouldn't have video, but you could dial in on a telephone and listen and participate in that way. And again, if people don't have email, and a lot of people at your station don't have email, then maybe a postal ballot is the way to go. Again, it's going to depend on your station, your stakeholders, who your members are, their understanding of technology. It's really difficult to have a one-size-fits-all approach to those sort of things. Again, I think it's just about being sensible, being fair and reasonable, and trying to find a way to suit as many people as possible. You're never going to please or be able to suit 100% of people. Even a face-to-face meeting doesn't suit 100% of people. Adrian Basso's asked about cooperatives, and I can talk a little bit about that. All cooperatives must hold an AGM within 5 months of the end of their financial year, and basically, again, I'll put some information up on this. They can certainly apply for an extension. In Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia and Queensland, cooperative regulators have waived fees and are allowing that to happen. In New South Wales, cooperatives can delay their AGM and annual term without application if they would like. My understanding, and Adrian, I might clarify for this view because I don't have it right in front of me. Hang on, maybe I do.
I think I've got that stuff on file, so I'll have a dig through for that now, and I'll email it through to you in a second, John. But while I look that up, I just wanted to bring up that when we were talking there before about sort of people who might have difficulty with information technology being involved in these meetings. The flip side of that is June Donovan from 2RDJ says they had a meeting in June this year for all members, had a formal agenda, announced the programming committee and other coordinator positions. Said it was very successful and attendance was up from former physical meetings. Jeff asked the question there about online platform providers to recommend and facilitating anonymous optional preferential voting for board positions. As stated earlier, we will get on down to that one and provide that information. Greg King, I believe, have you responded to Greg's question? I believe you have. So the cooperative question for Adrian, I'll have to try and have a look for that.
I've got that here. I found it while you've been talking, Danny. So the you must adhere to the requirements of rules of the cooperative and the cooperative's national law Victoria if you use alternative means to hold meetings, including teleconferencing or video conferencing. So, Adrian, not particularly clear. The national law permits directors to hold board meetings. It's not a very clear one. I will try and get some clearer information for you.
Excellent. And just in response to questions like the ones from Jeff Peake about the online platform providers to recommend for voting and everything else to do with your online meeting. As John stated, Zoom has been working out pretty good. Everyone's getting pretty good with it because of the pandemic. And I put a link there, Connecting Up, who John mentioned before earlier. They've got a discounted version available there to not-for-profits, so it might be one worth checking out. The link is there in the chat. I will also include that as part of the follow-up correspondence that we're sending through to everyone. Kerry says, yes, we will indeed circulate the information on co-ops to everyone as part of the follow-up after the meeting. I think hopefully we might have even got through everything on the Q&A. I will continue to go through everything that's there in the questions, but I believe hopefully we may have answered everything. In the unlikely event that we haven't, or if when you're lying in bed tonight you come up with another question, feel free to send that on because we're more than happy to assist with that and do everything we can. Di Collins asks, can I please answer June's question? Is that this one? We have 2 PCs set up in the station with Zoom for use by people who don't have the technology at home to attend meetings. So I don't know if that's June's question that you're referring to there, but a good point there. So for people who might not sort of have access to online, June has obviously set up a sort of socially distanced thing there at home. Oh no, June's question is the one webinar versus Zoom, but that's wonderful work there to sort of have things there set up at the station. Now this question is, which Zoom facility do you favour for remote AGMs? Conference call or webinar? There's also meetings on there as well. I know that meetings and webinar is very similar. Our webinars here today, you're able to access them and take part via a phone. John, you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think whatever system you use, the system that allows the most functionality to suit your members is probably best. And I would say maybe you don't need to make a decision between conference call or webinar. The Zoom platform, for example, does enable you to dial in and participate along with people that are using the video conferencing functionality. So finding something that's that uses both methodologies is probably really good. It enables people that don't have computers to just dial in, or people that would prefer to have a computer and participate in that way to dial in. So I think it's use what's best, and I think particularly for stations with older demographics of volunteers or members, using a system that enables either telephone or video conference facility is probably a really great option.
Excellent. Now, Annette Smith raised, would it be advisable to add a remote voting into your constitution? There are several of the sort of fair trading bodies have in their model rules recently updated them to say not so much remote voting, but electronic means of holding meetings, which would cover remote voting and other aspects like that as part of what is being done and how you're running your meeting. So what I will do is I will look for a bit of that stuff and I will send it through as part of the follow-up, because it's probably worthwhile to have that there, because it's not just for sort of voting at your meetings or anything like that. It's just sort of it gives you the leverage there in your constitution to be able to run things remotely.
And I look, just further to that, I definitely suggest that it's great to have flexibility in your constitution, so that if this ever happened again, and let's hope it doesn't in our lifetimes anyway, that you can run virtual AGMs. And as I said earlier, there's some benefits to for some stations to running virtual AGMs as well. There's a question there from Kerry about, does CBAA have a policy position about whether stations should run virtual AGMs if it is possible or not? I would suggest that it's up to a station. Every station is different. Every station has different circumstances. Every station is in a different location and has different issues to deal with. I don't think there's one rule that's right for everyone. That's a decision for your committee to make whilst consulting with other stakeholders, but it's a decision for the committee to make on whether you conduct your AGM or you delay it. As long as you're functioning again with good faith, transparently, and consulting, there should be no real problems with doing that. You may have disgruntled members, but I think what's really important is that committees are empowered to make these decisions and should be able to make these decisions.
Excellent. Now, Carolyn said she's got a sort of couple of questions here in the Q&A. When mentioning essential only items, then holding an extraordinary meeting afterwards, can that be as simple as voting for board members? So I think she's sort of saying, is it one of those things where you could maybe just sort of, the AGM would just be for the voting on the board positions, and the other sort of items that you might have on the agenda could be dealt with down the track?
Another good question. I think what's on your AGM agenda, you need to look at two things. What does your constitution say needs to be on your AGM agenda? We'll often have things like, obviously, election of office bearers. It may require you to approve an auditor. It may require you to confirm minutes of the last meeting, last AGM. It may not. It may require you to discuss or conduct business for which with appropriate notice has been given. So, and obviously your annual financial reports or annual reports. So there are going to be a number of things that are in your constitution. Make sure you check your constitution. You obviously can't just not do what your constitution says, but you may decide to not have as long a general business section if you have it. Or some stations, I know I was talking to a station yesterday in South Australia who had their member of parliament, a local member of parliament, come and give a presentation. Maybe you don't need to do that aspect of it, because that certainly wouldn't be a constitutional requirement.
Okay, and I think further to that, she said, when you say we're now allowed 3 months later, is that 3 months on from when they would be running their AGM, or is it the 3 months extension is from when they apply for it, I believe. Is that correct?
The 3 month extension, I think, is from the last period, the last time you can actually hold it. So for a cooperative, for example, that's 5 months. For some charities, that's 6 months, and it's the extension beyond that. Again, if it's 3 months in Victoria, it's 3 months, I think, beyond the 5 months from memory that you need to run that AGM. So you can run it 3 months later than the last deadline.
Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, Peter's just asked, there might be a catch-22 for some stations where they need to run a remote AGM, but the constitution needs to be changed before they can. Peter, I'm not sure, I can't remember what state you're in, but in a lot of cases that you actually, Danny, do you know what state Peter's in? I just can't.
Shake can be from 210. That's on the border of New South Wales and Queensland.
Right. So
10 FM, sorry.
That's all right. If you have a look, Peter, at the flowchart I gave, basically, if you're you are actually allowed to run an AGM regardless of your constitution. I say the New South Wales Incorporation's Consumer Affairs has given New South Wales stations, the same with Victoria and South Australia, incorporated associations, the ability to run your AGMs regardless of what your constitution says. So you can run yours, no problem at all, virtually.
Good question. Do you know if it's possible to still use proxy votes with remote voting? That's from Gemma Purves.
That will, if your constitution allows proxy votes, then you would still be able to use proxy votes in the same way. I mean, and that's one of the things you need to consider, how you're going to manage that. How are you going to know that Fred on the phone or on the video has 2 votes or 1 vote if they're carrying a proxy? You need to think through how those things are going to happen.
Vini Hiller asks, are there any Zoom/event consultants that can be hired? I would suggest that if you're getting the paid version of Zoom, the help that's provided online is always there and able to help you. They've got the live chat people who are there able to help out. But I wouldn't be surprised if this day and age there aren't people who are there as Zoom event consultants. But one that's sort of not ones that we know personally.
Danny, Cheryl's asked what the South Australian extension time is. It's actually the government in South Australia is granting a 6-month extension for associations to lodge their annual returns and hold annual general meetings.
Excellent. That'd be Cheryl Lowe from VFM. Wonderful stuff. Okay, then I think we're getting very close to 3 p.m. If I have forgotten anyone's questions, let us know in the chat box right away. And I might just sort of take control of the old screen sharing now, because there's a couple of things that I want to share with everyone, if that's all right. Thank you very much, everyone, for your patience today. Absolutely wonderful to be talking to you all. Now, they were all John's slides. They will be available following this, including all those helpful resources. Of course, if anyone has any questions, you can let us know about that. Get in touch with us here at the CBAA. Always happy to talk with you. Upcoming webinars include project management tools and resources, which will be happening on Tuesday, 13th of October, and emergency preparedness on Tuesday, 17th of November. Further details on how to register for those webinars will be included as part of the follow-up information that we'll be sending to everyone. And also, hopefully, everyone is there getting our CBAA newsletter. But between those 2 events, it's the CBAA conference. Registrations are now open. Hopefully, you got some email from us today to that effect. In 2020, the conference is going online, happening from Wednesday 28th to Saturday 31st of October 2020. You can go to the brand new conference website. That's conference.cbaa.org.au, or send an email to conference@cbaa.org.au. I'm just going to play a little bit of a video for you now. I'm really hoping the sound for this is going to work. Come on, video. Are you working? Is it working? I wonder if that sound's coming through to where you are. If it's not, I'm going to send it through to you. Because this is all the stuff that is happening at the conference. It is going to be absolutely fantastic. Obviously, we're going to miss the sort of networking aspect that we have. That's always one of the great things about conferences, that we're all sort of able to be there and doing our thing together. Obviously, the world has conspired to not allow that to be the case this year. So that is no good whatsoever. But, I mean, that's the way of the world, right? We're all getting used to that. I will just bring up, hopefully, is it still sharing? I'm going to show the screen for the CBAA conference website to give you a bit of an idea about things that are happening. Because although sort of it's no good that we're not able to sort of be there joining together in the one room, The plus side of that is the conference has never been more accessible and affordable. So I would very much suggest you go in there. That's the website there, conference.cbaa.org.au. Schedule there if you want to find out about all of the things that are happening. It is, of course, happening over a longer period of days than it normally does, from a Wednesday to the Saturday. Look at that. Look at all those beautiful, knowledgeable people there. Speakers there. And of course, you are able to book your place. I've already booked my place, so the prices come up here. So $15 for a single session, or $75 to register for the whole shebang. It's going to be the goods. Can't wait to see you there at the 2020 CBAA conference. I'll just have one last look there at the chat and whatnot to make sure that everything's been answered. Johnny, you seeing sort of anything in there we might have, with my duty there as a co-host? No, look at that. I'll tell you what, I think we've answered everything. If we haven't answered everything, we are more than happy to follow up with you at the conclusion of this webinar. As stated, I'll be sending all registrants to today's session a whole bunch of information about everything that we've discussed today. Also, of course, with everything that we've discussed, the information coming from the various authorities is evolving as the situation evolves. Hopefully it is getting better and better, but all of the fair trading bodies have been really fantastic in regards to how sort of sympathetic they've been to community organisations and giving us that leverage to run things remotely, to access technology and do everything that we can do in these very, very difficult times. On behalf of John, thank you, John, so much for presenting today's session. It was really wonderful. It's about 3 o'clock now, which means we've got to get out of here. If you missed anything, a recording will be available very shortly, and we are more than happy to follow up with you. Keep up the good work, everyone. Wonderful to hear everything that the community broadcasters are doing in this difficult time. Keep on doing your thing. Hopefully when the world rights itself, our communities will remember how much we were there for them. My name's Danny Chifley. On behalf of the Community Broadcasting Association of Australia, thanks so much for joining us today. Look forward to seeing you all real soon. Take care in the meantime.